This week in my tour of preserved Americana, I'm once again veering off the straight and narrow of just the National Park Service and inviting you into a story of a place that is NPS adjacent. The Brucemore Estate, just outside of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, is centered around a Queen Anne-style mansion built in 1886 by Carolyn Souter Sinclair, the widow of Thomas M. Sinclair. This Gilded Age mansion and estate ties neatly into the period we are in as the Sinclair Company made its money in the manner of businesses that were popping up all over the United States and were coming up with ways to use the new technology to solve old food problems. And in Iowa, this meant, initially, pigs. The Thomas Sinclair and later T.M. Sinclair Company used ice harvesting, railroads, and mechanical conveyor belts, steam ovens, and other wonders of the later 19th century to make pig slaughter, meat packing, and then the delivery of said meat products something that could happen around the world. By taking over and combining the disparate elements of the pork industry and creating a whole vertical stack of the elements required, Sinclair and later his sons were delivering bacon, sausage, and ham to English factory workers from the middle of North America. They would become a largely domestic company as Denmark took over the Northern European pork markets, not my area. But the meat-hungry belly of the United States was happy to eat up the offerings from the Sinclair Company and their companions in the market as we moved away from our farms and started shopping for meat, not at markets and butcher shops, but in stores. The Brucemore Estate in Iowa, the state's only National Historic Trust site, is owned and run by Brucemore Incorporated with a focus on historical preservation of the buildings and the land. Over time, they have dug into the people who actually made the estate run, the servants and other employees outside and below stairs, and the people working in the various enterprises that created this great wealth. The Sinclairs, the descendant families, and the subsequent owners of the property made the location one of curiosity and splendor. Brucemore and the Sinclair industrial legacy are all tied up in this week's episode as they are members of the group that helped drive the mechanization that led to much of what 20th century American food became. They had a pork processing empire. They harvested ice for year-round meat shipping. They used steamships to make the plenty of America a regular feature on plates around the world. Later occupants of Brucemore would go on to add to 20th century food mechanization with a cornstarch factory, a natural second offshoot of Iowa's corn after pork packing. And then the Halls would manufacture steel beams and quarry stone, two elements that would drive the switch to steel beam construction that are essential in both the large factory manufacturing settings used in modern packaged food and helped create the warehouse spaces we needed to make for moving and storing food all over the country, including all those refrigerated warehouses. It's a gorgeous place and constructed to work for a household that required servants. The fact that it spanned the time from gas lights and a fireplace in every room to 1981, where it had an array of refrigerators and freezers, central heating, and was cleaned with electric vacuum cleaners, no robots yet, makes it a fascinating place to see the rapid pace of technology in America and its products over the last 150 years or so. So when your travels or interests take you to places where the mythos of American plenty comes from, stop by the Brucemore Estate, just on the edge of Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Episode 175. New Technology for American Corn. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the new roles corn starts playing in and around American food in the latter half of the century. This is the age when corn stops having one job as a whole grain to be made into food and starts to be broken apart into the various pieces which will make it ubiquitous in American food moving forward. To learn all about the beginning of something new, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know, okay, you've probably already picked up on this, but this is as much a food technology podcast as it is a food history podcast. Because American food development seems to absolutely track side by side with the march of technology. I did start the whole series with iron. This is important now because the late 19th century is when corn stops just being a food product and begins to become a part of the larger chemical technology system that is an essential part of how modern American food works. At the beginning of America, and even before that, the food production in North America was keenly aware that making enough food to survive takes an enormous amount of human effort, and the American food system has long emphasized that it would be nice if we didn't have to work so hard to make food, or at least that some people didn't have to work so hard to get enough to eat. The American food system has also rotated around the idea that food could be a business to make money. The beginning of the entire Colonize America project leaned heavily on the idea that this, what colonizers saw as empty land, could be taken over and high-value crops could be grown on it, and the results could be exported for profits. The major early foods in this category were all brought from the Old World, Asia, Europe, and Africa, and as a result, the earliest crops were sugar, coffee, and rice. The fish, especially cod, supplies were so prodigious that cod was also an export crop of sorts. And all of these export crop schemes leaned hard on enslaved workers. They were the engine and cogs that made the machine that turned out this food possible. And in places where it wasn't technically slavery, say the cod producers, the wheat growers, and such living in dire marginal conditions, they had many of the same results. And so food was grown and processed by people living agonizing lives to make money for the few and cheaper food for the many. However, with waves of emancipation rolling around the globe, human slave labor was starting to be more expensive and was more of a bother to continue as laws and enforcement reduced its viability. But what truly spelled the end of large-scale profitable chattel slavery in America and in much of the world was the arrival of the machines. The chemical and mechanical revolution that had been cooking along since the late 17th century burst out in the 19th with world-changing devices like large steel furnaces and steam engines. Just as the railroad and soon the gasoline engine put to rest the donkey problem, see episodes 143 and 164 for more details, the machine age would change the parameters of the human labor question. In the mechanical space, chemicals were not only named and better understood, they were being mined and purified and even synthesized at industrial scale. This is the first age, where any regular person could purchase soap and washing soda that had been made in a factory, rather than created painstakingly from ashes you had diligently collected from your own fire. There had been the midpoint when we moved from simply using our hands to getting gears and cranks and levers involved. We used wind power and water power and donkeys and humans turning wheels to crush things and grind them and turn saws. But it was the mechanization of manufacture, the arrival of the steam engine, that truly spelled the end for slavery. Why deal with all the logistics of feeding and clothing and housing fractious human beings when you could just feed fuel into the belly of a mechanical beast? Dreams of emerging mechanical utopias began dancing in the heads of men who thought the power of engines could overturn society, and among other things, make it so the struggle to make enough food might be a thing of the past. The human work could be moved up the chain of production a little. Instead of hand-smashing sugarcane and flailing and sifting grain by hand, now humans could tend the machines that did the labor to the food. And with corn, with its easy-to-handle cobs of grain, that was a natural progression. There were machines, sure, the simple kind, to plow the fields and even make the mounds for the plants. Yeah, you had to use a hoe to weed the corn, but once it got going, all one had to do was defend it and then harvest the cobs. And once those were dry, there were machines, again, simple, to shuck the cobs and strip the kernels. And instead of the hand pounding on a samp block, or hand grinding on a hand-turned millstone, or cracked with a hominy block, Americans turned to powered sets of millstones. And in all of these instances, the corn had a single fate. It was going to be food. Much of it was people food, but as time went on and wheat spread out over the plains, more and more corn could be fed to meat animals. So the corn was indirectly feeding people, but it was food all the same. But then, in the midst of the rising chemical and mechanical cacophony, wet milling was applied to corn. It could now be separated and processed and become a chemical, and soon a series of chemical inputs into the growing collection of purified outputs that would be recombined to make a whole new class of food and food accessories. So what does this weird meditation on the transformation of the American food system from human and animal-powered to machine-powered have to do with corn exactly? Because it seems like I'm just wandering around in a library here. But the item that is at the end of this meander is cornstarch. And it's because during this later part of the 19th century is when America gets cornstarch on a large scale, and corn expands from simply a food for man or beast to a component that will change the trajectory of food manufacture generally. So just what is cornstarch and what is wet milling and why does all of this matter? Well, I'll get there. But before I do, let's review at this point just how people were eating their corn. And even though we are at the end of the 19th century, most of the ways they're eating it are thousands of years old. The least common way was the way modern Americans think of consuming corn now, as the underripe or green corn, or what we think of as sweet corn, the stuff we go out and buy at the grocery store, the stuff that's plucked off the stalks and cooked more or less immediately. In the 19th century, this was a seasonal and regional treat. If you lived near a farm growing corn for other purposes, there would be a period when some of the immature corn was picked and eaten. As more people were moving off farms, the nostalgia for this sort of corn grew, and some farmers took advantage of the popularity of green corn and were selecting varieties that were sweeter and more tender. These were to be specifically grown and used and eaten as green or sweet corn. The growth of canned food further drove the development of sweet corn varieties and even created a piece of baseball slang. See, back in this age, people were starting to go to stores along with their outdoor markets to get their food. But in a store, one didn't wander the aisles choosing boxes of crackers and cans of beans and tins of baking soda. Instead, you sent a list or delivered an order over the counter. The shopkeeper and his assistants would collect the items, package them up, and then, depending on your social class, hand them to you, hand them to your servant, or have a delivery boy bring them to you. The back of the store often contained living quarters for parts of the staff and storage for barrels and bags and crates of bulk items. The front of the store would contain a portion of these goods, and a common practice was to have the shelves above head height of canned goods, with canned corn being a popular and common object. Some items would be retrieved by someone placing and scaling a ladder and bringing it down, but more common for sturdy objects like canned food, a long stick would be used to drop the cans down, and any shop assistant worth their salt wouldn't catch the goods in their hands, rather with their ubiquitous aprons. After all, laundry being such a royal giant enormous pain, people would wear their clothes multiple days in a row and protect them with things like aprons. Anyway, the recognition of this somewhat stylish but easy catch made its way over into this newfangled city pastime of baseball. A consequence of more and larger cities and close together living people working factory jobs with set hours, as opposed to the scattered life of agriculture where the schedule is the animals and the weather rather than the clock, led to more and more group leisure time activities. And one of the pastimes to gain popularity was baseball. So as players would watch a ball go up high, and then they would have plenty of time to get under it and make an easy catch, catching one of those balls became known as a can of corn. Anyway, the fresh sweet corn and then canned corn, while popular then and now, were the minority of corn consumed. Nearly all of the corn people and animals ate was the product of the mature, dried field or dent corn. This is the corn that is dried and then ground into meal or parched over heat or soaked in lye to make hominy and masa. Parched corn was going out of style, taking dried corn kernels and roasting them to drive out any residual water and weaken the starch and protein structures within the corn to make it in sort of an instant food was on the wane. The toasted kernels would break easily, so could be crushed without the effort normally required for grinding corn, and because that roasting and toasting of the corn kernels was also cooking them. They would mix into hot liquids and make an edible mush much more quickly than regular cornmeal would. Parched corn was popular when mills were in short supply, but the combined fact that parched corn required so much individual effort and the result was least like the grain uses 19th century Americans had with their other cooking traditions, it caused parched corn to fall out of favor. It had long been a food for people who were living at the margins, and as more people had home and hearth or a place to purchase food from, parched corn largely went away. Lye-soaked corn was still popular, particularly in areas where there were larger populations of people who had been in North America the longest, and where wheat, especially hard or high gluten wheat, didn't grow. So, that is, the Southeast. In the prairies, the cooler, drier weather meant that corn there dried out quickly, making it less subject to rotting and being munched on by bugs and small mammals in its moist state. But the warmer the climate was and the higher the rainfall, getting one's corn to dry in a timely manner was a tougher challenge. So in places where drying the corn as fast as possible wasn't an option, treating it with a base made it less attractive to all the little corn predators and kept it from sprouting. Anyway, lye-treated corn was eaten in a few ways. The least effort was when it was just rinsed and simply eaten as whole, swollen kernels or hominy, or what you can find now, also called pozole. It could be its own dish with creamy additions or added to soups and stews. A second way hominy was consumed was after being soaked in lye, the kernels were re-dried and ground and served as grits. Modern Americans mostly encounter grits as a breakfast food. Some people like to make them sweet with a bit of sugar or molasses, but they are also often appreciated as a foil to strongly flavored items like spicy sausage and sharp cheese. Grits as a foil to strong flavors links them back to their earlier role as an addition to midday dinner. Because of the amount of time it takes for grits to really cook, one might have had cold grits for breakfast when stoves required you to light a fire, unless of course you had a dedicated cook. When we think of potatoes and pasta and modern foods, that's where you'd find grits. With a quick peek in at New Orleans, which was beginning to become a destination not just for river traffic business, but also for food and debauchery, the word was starting to spread about gumbo. I know this because versions, occasionally good but more often regrettable, were starting to show up in cookbooks outside of the Crescent City. I'll get deep into gumbo lore in another episode, but it is essential to note that all of the gumbo tradition that came out of New Orleans at this time was Creole gumbo, or city food. Cajun gumbo, or food that was country, was not the version being leaked out into the world. And the important distinction for our purposes here is that Creole gumbo was made with butter and served with rice. Cajun gumbo was made with lard and served with grits. And now for the third and least popular lye-soaked corn application in cuisine dominated by English, French, and German cooking habits was when those kernels would be milled into whole meal masa. This soft meal could then be formed into a flat bread, tortilla, or used as a dough to surround other bits of meat and vegetables and spices and create tamales, as well as a whole other variety of foods that simply don't break the surface in America. However, for the most part, masa made very little imprint on United States food. It certainly lived on in places that had long been ruled over by the Spanish crown and the Mexican state, but then suddenly found themselves inside the United States. Surprise? But there's not a single English language cookery book helping the emerging housewife of the newly mechanical 19th century in America that even mentions masa. But all that aside, the way most corn most Americans were eating in the late 1800s was as cornmeal. It was generally cheaper than flour, and due to the fact that cornbread was never expected to rise, making bready things out of cornmeal was always faster. Cornmeal mushes were still around, though they might be reimagined as sweets with butter and eggs and molasses added for a nice Indian pudding or corn puddings. And corn had also gone to Europe and West Africa with the Spanish and Portuguese, so cornmeal mushes, without a trip through the lye soak, had spread many places these traders had put into port and beyond. Cornmeal mush had acquired international travel miles starting in the 1500s, so now in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and the 1890s, when immigration from the old world to the new went into fast-forward mode from Europe, new versions of cornmeal mush came back from study abroad to mix up the American cornmeal mush scene. Overall, polenta will have the largest presence and arrives on the American scene with Southern Italian immigrants in much of the 1880s. They are going to give our produce assortment a shot in the arm, transform their own cuisine in the face of America's astounding access to meat. But for our purposes, the Southern Italian immigration into America will ignite the grits versus polenta confusion. With easier access to ovens, the iron plate ovens, the bake kettles we now know as Dutch ovens, cornbread of multiple consistencies and sweetness will proliferate throughout America's tastes and territories. The fact that baking soda is something you can now purchase and carry about in watertight tins will elevate cornbreads from a dense and disappointing part of dinner to something truly tasty. The ability of baking soda to transform cornbread from fire cakes, Johnny cakes, hoe cakes, and pones, food that you just have around due to necessity, to nice cornbread and light cornbread and rich cornbread means that breads made of cornmeal are no longer a food of obligation. People begin to choose to eat cornbread. In this context, when recipes of the 18th and 19th century designate a recipe as nice or rich, that implies a fancy recipe rather than one for every day. Nice and rich recipes will employ ingredients that are not always going to be in the pantry. They often call for butter rather than drippings, that is, leftover fat or even lard. They usually call for eggs, which are still somewhat seasonal, and they may specify new milk instead of boiled or sour milk. Though many of the cornbread recipes of this age required sour milk for the acid it contained to activate the baking soda to get the bread to rise and be fluffy and light. Cornmeal, that ground corn that has not been chemically treated with lye or lime or anything else, makes many appearances in many of the local cuisines arriving with immigrants during this period. But only a few managed to make a lasting mark on the middle-of-the-road cuisine where I've been trying to stay. However, there are two uses of cornmeal that were on the edges that have absolutely left their mark on modern mainstream American cuisine. The first is the hot tamale. So the traditional tamale uses masa as a dough to encase filling and of course is steamed or poached, wrapped in a corn husk. However, in the darker days of slavery, as West Africans were transported around the Gulf of Mexico to various ports on its edges and sloshed around as cogs in various machines to accomplish agriculture and harvesting, with escapes, recaptures, and all manner of stories lost or ignored, the knowledge of the tamale became part of the world of the American black agricultural worker, particularly around the Mississippi River Delta. However, these people lacked access to masa. It simply wasn't a thing America knew about, even if some Americans did. As a portable food, a tamale has much to offer. It's wrapped, it's tasty, and while best hot, it is just fine at room temperature. You can make a bunch with your community and hand them out, and it can be adjusted easily to whatever's on hand. It's the hand pie for the corn world. The American adapted hot tamale would take on local flavors and ingredients. So instead of masa, they are made with a cornmeal dough, which also means steaming isn't enough. Hot tamales are simmered to bring the dough together, and the fillings are spicier. Some were even red hot, as the songs say. And canned foods were part of the game, so tomato sauces as simmer broth, or even as part of the filling, could be included. And because much of the agriculture of the Delta was centered around sugar and cotton and some rice, and not corn, many, if not most of the wrappers of the traditional Mississippi Delta hot tamale were paper, not corn husks. And This was made even more so by the proliferation of newspapers once wood pulp paper arrived on the scene, also at about this time. Now, are there many ways to make hot tamales? Yes. So many, in fact, that you can follow the hot tamale trail in the Mississippi Delta to sample the diversity of method and flavor. But it is the cornmeal and the hot chili flavor that binds them all together. The second cornmeal-based food that is hanging out around the edges and is still with us are versions of scrapple. Now, they have names like panhouse and liver mush and pudding meat. And while each originates from separate locales, they can all trace their origins back to Northern European traditions of meat puddings, or the forebearers of sausages. In all cases, they come from the category of food that contains head cheese and haggis, where you have dealt with all the nice, easy parts of a butchered animal, the cow, the pig, the sheep, the goat, and all you have left are the bits and some pieces. These are often blanched, usually chopped, spiced with what you've got, things like onion, garlic, sage, and so on. And then they're bound together with a starch, oats, rice, or in America, obviously, cornmeal. In the old country, choose your old country, these mixtures would be boiled in a handy container. Stomachs, less popular now, but still a part of haggis, and intestines, wildly popular and still a part of modern cuisine. But now that we are in America with our iron pans and iron stoves and the lard is flowing, all of these old world scrap meat puddings were renamed and then fried in iron skillets on iron stoves. Now, if you'd like a refresher on meat puddings of yore that are the ancestors of scrapple and such, check out episodes 17, 23, and 26. So, are scrapple and its relatives tasty or disgusting? The answer, as with most foods, is it depends. When people were taking up the last of the animal they had raised and slaughtered and were looking at these bits seriously as something that would get them through the year, there was pride and care and expertise that went into the making of the scrapple. Sure, some people were terrible cooks and the result was not tasty, but quite a bit of it was. So tasty, in fact, that as pig butchery moved off the farm and into the factory, scrapple remained a product. But instead of being a product of survival, it became a dumping ground. As with sausage, scrapple and its cousins, produced at industrial scale, was no longer made with care. Instead, it was more of a way to squeeze a little more profit out of the pig. And so things like scrapple, liver mush, panhouse, and so on would become a byword for gross. Now, this is a worthwhile period of time to look at these items because this is the early period of industrialization of American food, when this sort of cornmeal-based food went from something that was important for survival, it was local and often tasty, but transformed to something that was a commodity and became mediocre and would eventually transform into something generally regarded as disgusting. By the late 19th century, corn, and especially cornmeal, had worked its way into a number of foods, things that I feel like we can call American. Sure, they have roots in other cultures, but the particular food landscape of America, both the ingredients and the technology for cooking them, have caused a metamorphosis. American food is, once again, the fusion of food and local tech. And technology brings us, finally, to the last part of this journey, the arrival of cornstarch. Two things had to come together to make this happen: industrial manufacture of chemicals for the use in industrial-sized processes, and the production of metal milling components that would work for wet instead of dry milling. Okay, we're finally here. What is wet milling, you ask? So, traditionally in dry milling, when grains are ground into flour, the grains must be properly dried so the pressure of the stone mill wheels would crack and grind them instead of smooshing them. There is traditional wet milling, where grains have been soaked in something to swell them so they can be ground into a paste or dough. Things like idli dough in Indian cuisine or masa from corn that has been soaked in lye, these are perfect examples. But these are examples of things where everything is ground together, and it's a similar technology used in grinding nuts to pastes or milling olives for oil. The process cornstarch depends on is modern wet milling. That the corn that goes through that sort of wet milling is separated into parts. And to separate corn into its parts, well, a lye soak is the wrong thing. Wet milled corn is actually soaked in a weak acid bath. An oversimplified way of differentiating these two processes is that when you soak meat and grain in lye or other bases, like calcium carbonate and that sort of stuff, the excess negative ions cause the tissues of the material to unwind and absorb more water. But when they're soaked in an acid, the tissues wind up more tightly. They expel moisture and the internal structures pull apart. A helpful visual is when you think of fish subjected to an acid or a base. If you think of lutefisk, that is fish soaked in lye or a base, it gets all squashy and floppy and becomes sort of translucent. Ceviche, on the other hand, this is fish soaked in acid. And in that case, the fish firms up and it becomes opaque. Again, a generalization, but it does get the point across. So when corn grains are subjected to an acid bath instead of lye, they get wet, but the starches and the proteins and the germ, or the fatty part that contains the actual sprout, they all become easier to separate. And that is what American wet milling was doing. It was giving corn a soak in a weak acid bath, crushing them, letting the fatty, tough germ float out, and washing the remaining protein out of the starch. The starch would be dried and ground and then sent out into the world. That seems like a lot of work. Why go to all this trouble? Well, America and the world loved starch. Long ago, only rich people could get starch because you had to soak and crush and strain grains for it. Wheat starch was okay, but rice starch was considered superior. Though if you wanted fabrics to be really stiff, egg whites turned out to be great for that. Anyway, when the savory potato made it back to Europe, one of its big roles was to provide potato starch. And that's what's holding up all those crazy wide lace collars like Queen Elizabeth I and a bunch of the rich Dutch people are wearing. Starch would also become important in weaving. It made the threads easier to work with, and it was applied to cloth to keep that ironed look for much longer. Starch would also protect cloth from body oils and from some stains, which were important things in the days when laundry was a giant, enormous pain. Starch shirts, collars, aprons, and bonnets were all signs that one was put together and classy. So the demand for starch was on the rise. On the food front, as more flour-based sauces became part of American food, something that would allow gravies and sauces to cook without clumping was desired. Flour had proteins in it, which causes the clumps, but starch, if stirred into cool liquids, will simply thicken. Then there was the jelly pudding craze. Sure, you could make pudding with the gelatin from calves and pigs, or use isinglass from fish bladders. But with a vegetable starch, puddings became even faster. Starch-based pudding was really becoming all the rage. So from fabric manufacture to fashion to foods, America was excited about starch. And so figuring out how to extract starch easily was tempting. And so corn, as the starchiest grain, became the source of industrial extracted starch. In the U.S., English immigrants, William Colgate and then Thomas Kingford, established some of the earliest starch and then cornstarch factories in the U.S. While cornstarch as laundry aid was its most common use in the beginning, as manufactured foods started to take off, the stabilizing power of cornstarch and foods and medicines alike meant that cornstarch would start to find its way into all manner of items you could purchase off the shelf. But wait, there's one more thing. Cornstarch led directly to corn syrup. Because starches are simply long chains of simple carbohydrates, they can be broken apart into their component parts, which are largely sugars. And all living things, at their cellular level, do require glucose to live. It's what cells need to go. Humans with our puny single stomach can only do so much breaking down. So there are some parts of plants that we can break down only into starches but not to sugars. Cows and other cudcheurs with more robust fermentation operations on board can extract more sugars from leafier parts of plants. But the chemical operations that were starting to be formed around the US at the time, they were best at it of all. So the cornstarch we didn't use to look sharp and fancy or didn't make into pudding was being treated with hydrochloric acid and then heated under pressure. Messy, but cheaper than the whole growing and milling sugar rigmarole. And corn syrup could be made from something, cornstarch, that was really shelf stable. By the way, we make corn syrup from cornstarch using enzymes. It's less intensive and it reduces the exploding hot acid accidents. And the corn syrup I'm talking about, that's basically the Karo syrup you can buy at the grocery store. It's largely glucose. High fructose corn syrup is a complex, multi-step process that only developed in the 20th century. So here we go. From the very beginning, corn has been an absolutely essential ingredient in American food. But it used to be incredibly obvious. The most hiding corn did was to be part of thirded bread, a mix of wheat, rye, and cornmeal. But now, corn is transferring into an ingredient that will sneak into many places. As cornstarch, as corn syrup, and both are extremely stable ingredients that can live on the shelf until needed. Humans have long broken down plants and animals into smaller parts and then recombined them into recipes, stews, pies, layer cakes. But the end of the 19th century, when those parts begin to get much smaller, having a larger selection of ingredients that can wait for you on the shelf until needed is going to change the way we cook, the way we think about, and even the way we shop for food. And corn is right there in the middle of it. Next week, I'll take a look at how canning is going to change the oceans. While canning is a food preservation miracle and will improve the nutrition of many Americans by giving them access to food variety across economic classes in startling new ways, the frenzy of canning crossed with railroads and steamships is also going to empty oceans and seashores. So come back for the canning frenzy that is gripping the nation and consider just how fish cakes became part of American food. Thanks for listening. There's really only one way this podcast grows, and it's by word of mouth. So tell your friends about where to find the roots of some of our strangest food trends and be sure to leave a review. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com, and as always, I love hearing what you have to say in your reviews. The music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. You can find me on Threads, Blue Sky, and Insta as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.